Today I am staying close to home for this video, and actually I kind of want your opinions as to what you think about this crazy story that I'm going to tell today that involves adultery, sex, corruption, and murder, and well, possibly even a wrongfully convicted person who has spent the last 40 years in prison based on incorrect evidence. Today's story takes place in Andalusia, Alabama, which, like I said, is pretty close to home. And I've filmed here several times before. I've got several videos from Andalusia, Alabama, where I am. They have a Christmas deal here that they call Candyland. There's an old abandoned jail that I've talked about, and this courthouse right here behind me that I always say reminds me of the Back to the Future courthouse. Today's story, it revolves around the murder of Julie Bonds McCrory and the aftermath of it. In the late 1970s here at Andalusia High School, two students met and fell in love, Charles McCrory and Julie Ann Bonds. They started dating, and right about the time they hit that 5-year dating mark, they decided to get married. So they went off and got married. Then they bought this house right here in Andalusia, Alabama. They both got decent jobs, and very quickly, Julie became pregnant. Charles and Julie were ecstatic, and their firstborn child was a baby boy named Chad, and he was born in 1982. So he's about, 2 years older than I am at this point. So he's about 39, 40 years old. By 1985, though, both Charles and Julie's relationship, they had gotten into a rut. Both of them, they kind of felt like something was missing. And by April of 1985, they decided to take a break and they separated. Charles, he moved out of the family home and he got his own apartment that's just a few blocks away from here. And then very shortly after the separation, Charles began having an affair with a co-worker where he worked named Gloria Wiggins. That affair, it actually didn't last too long. In fact, they only had a couple of sexual encounters, and Charles, he started to feel guilty, and he called it off. On May the 30th of 1985, Charles, he was starting to work new hours where he worked at the Alabama Electric Cooperative, which is like the power company down here in South Alabama. So he was working a later shift, and now he was switching to an earlier shift that had him go in at 7:30 a.m. and he got off at 4:30 p.m. These hours were new to Charles, and he had a real hard time adjusting to them. So on the 30th, that morning, he wakes up and he's gotten up late. So he has to rush to get dressed and get to work to be there on time so he's not late. That forced him to miss breakfast that morning. Well, luckily, Julie calls early in the morning, and she asks if she can drop off some paperwork and stuff on her way to work. And he agrees. And then he asks her if she can stop by Hardee's and pick him up some breakfast. So Julie, her routine was she got up, and because she went to work later than Charles, she dropped Chad, their child, off with Charles's parents. They babysat him during work days. And then she swung by Hardee's on that morning of the 30th, and she picked up breakfast, and she dropped it off to Charles at work, and then she went to work, and she worked for a company called Prolete Specialty Company, which is like an electrical supply store. So they go on about their day. Well, then later that evening, after Charles and Julie were off, Julie went by and picked up Chad from Charles's parents, and then Julie, Chad, and Charles, they all met right back here at their family home, where they ate a good dinner and Julie had agreed to do Charles's laundry, so she was washing and folding his laundry while Charles was out in the den playing with Chad. And then they all sat down on the couch and they watched the newest episode of Hill Street Blues that was coming on that night. Once that show ended, Charles and Julie, they left Chad in the den while he was watching TV, and they went into the bedroom for about 25 or 30 minutes, and it was consensual. And then once they had finished, they came out, and Charles kisses Chad and Julie, and he tells them both good night. He loads up his baskets of freshly washed and folded laundry, and then at about 10 p.m. that night, he gets into his Ford Bronco, and he backs out of the driveway, and he leaves, headed back to his apartment. The very next morning, on May the 31st in 1985, Charles, this is his second day on this new schedule, and he woke up late again. So again, he has to rush to get ready, and he races to work to make sure he's there on time. And again, he misses breakfast. Well, once he got to work, he started thinking about the day before when Julie had brought Hardee's by to him for breakfast. So he decides to ask and see if she would be willing to do it again. So from his office, he picks up the phone and he calls Julie, but this time he gets no answer. Charles thought maybe she was driving, maybe she was en route to his parents' house to drop Chad off. So he calls his parents. His mom says, no, we haven't seen her yet. And he's thinking, well, maybe she's still driving in between the two locations. So he says, hey, when she gets there, tell her to call me. And he hangs up. So this particular morning, Julie had to be at work at about 8 o'clock. And when Charles hadn't heard from anyone by 8:15, he picks up the phone again and he calls his parents back. And again, they say, no, we haven't heard from Julie yet. It's unusual. She's normally here by now. So Charles, he hangs up with his parents, and then he calls Julie's work, Triple H Specialty Company, and they say, no, she's late. She hasn't shown up yet. So now he's really worrying. So he calls his parents back again, and he expresses his concern, and Charles's dad agrees to drive over to their family home and check on her, see how she's doing. And then when he hangs up the phone with his parents, he knows his dad's going over there, but something's not sitting right with him. He don't feel right about it. So he decides that he's going to leave work and go to the house to check on her too. Charles's dad gets to the house first. And when he gets there, he notices that the front door is standing open, like not all the way fully open, but like halfway. And so he gets out and he walks up to the front door. And as soon as he gets there, he notices Julie laying on the living room floor, deceased. Charles's dad, he goes through the front door. As soon as he saw her laying there, his first thought is Chad. So he busts in through the front door and he runs to the back of the house. And thankfully, Chad is unharmed. He's laying in his bed and he's still asleep. So Charles's dad scoops him up and carries him across the street to a neighbor's house where he'll be safe. And Charles's dad calls 911 and he leaves Chad over there with these neighbors as he walks back towards the house. And about the time he gets back over here to the front yard, Charles is pulling into the driveway. As soon as Charles gets out of his Bronco, his dad stops him and says, no, stop, you don't need to see it, it's bad. Charles immediately says, where's Chad? And the dad tells him he's fine, he's safe, he's across the street, it's just Julie, it's bad. It didn't take long at all before the Andalusia Police Department and the Covington County Sheriff's Department, they were on the scene here. In the original police report, they noted that Julie, she was laying in the living room floor, face down, like in a prone position, right near the front door, and that she was wearing a pink nightgown, and that pink nightgown was pushed up to her waist, and she had nothing on below it, and so she was exposed, and this suggested to them that there had been a sexual assault. Well, they also noted that Julie's eyes were blackened and her face was all bruised up, and it appeared as if Julie had taken a serious beating. The investigators found in Julie's hands clumps of hair, and there was also a clump of hair that was laying on her breast. Julie had some torn pantyhose tied around her right wrist, and then there was a red bandana laying on the floor, kind of sticking out from under her legs. It was underneath her. Now, these items, the hair and the red bandana, they were tested within a few days, and they did not belong to either Charles or Julie, but just, several days after all of this happened, the local law enforcement in the area, they lost these items. So they were never able to be tested against anyone else. To this day, they have no clue where that bandana or those pieces of hair went. It was clear to everyone Julie had been tortured. At that time in 1985, the local law enforcement here in the area, they weren't as big as it is now. There's a lot of police down here. Well, back in 1985, when something happened like this, they had to call crime scene technicians from Montgomery to come up and go over the scene and do all that. So they called these technicians from Montgomery, and they taped off the house. And while they waited on the techs to arrive, which it was going to take them probably about 2 hours, it's an hour and a half ride from Montgomery to here. And then on top of that, they would have had to go by their office to pick up their supplies and stuff. So they had to wait a good couple of hours. And while they were waiting, they took statements from both Charles and his dad. Now, once the crime scene techs arrived here on scene, they notated that they could not find any signs of a struggle. They noted that there was no signs of forced entry, and they noted in the report that the dad, when he arrived, he found the front door open. The court records indicated that when the police originally arrived, even though they cited in their report no forced entry, the court records showed that one of the windows in Julie's bedroom, one of those windows were wide open. The responding officers believed that Julie was the one who had opened it. And unbelievably, as the morning turned into afternoon and it started heating up outside, they were waiting on these crime scene techs to come. One of the officers, he closed that window and then turned the air conditioner on in the house. Because of that officer closing that window, it was closed when the crime scene techs got there. And because of that, that window was never swabbed or dusted or anything. They didn't check for fingerprints or any other kind of evidence on that window at all because it was closed when they got there. I mean, it's unbelievable how bad this was handled. On top of that, the court records also show that the only places in the home that they did dust for fingerprints was the front doorknob, not the door, just the doorknob. There was an empty pitcher sitting on the kitchen table, a drink pitcher that was made out of glass. They dusted it. They dusted one of the kitchen chairs, and it was just because it was pushed back from the table a little bit. And then in the kitchen sink, there were 3 novelty drinking glasses. 2 of them were Snoopy, and one of them was Care Bears, and they dusted those. Nothing else was dusted in the entire house. Not the sliding glass door on the back of the house, no windows, no light switches, no knives from the kitchen, no tools from the toolbox, not even a fireplace poker was dusted. And even when law enforcement discovered that Julie had been stabbed, which we're going to come back to in a second, they still didn't go back and check anything or dust anything for fingerprints. There was no knife laying near the body, so they just marked no murder weapon found and went on about their business. Very little evidence was recovered from the home here. Just the items near her body, like the hair and the bandana. And then, like I said, they wound up losing that a week or two after the fact. So basically they had Julie's remains. And then they found in the backyard, one solid footprint. It was right next to the back fence that led over to a local excavating company right behind their house. Investigators took pictures of that footprint. They didn't take any cast or anything. They just took pictures of it, and they tried to match that print up to Charles and Julie, and it did not match any boots or anything that either one of them had at the time. Julie's remains were sent to Montgomery for an autopsy. Julie had long defensive bruises on the back of her hands. Her jaw was broken in 2 places. She had 11 stab wounds to her left breast that they were able to determine occurred after she died. And she had 6 chops to her head with a sharp object. The coroner also noted that he thought she died from a blunt force trauma to the back of her head. Lastly, The coroner noted in his report that there were 2 small indentions on the back of Julie's arm. At the time, the coroner suggested that these may be teeth marks, but he was unsure. Altogether, Julie was brutally tortured to death that morning, and it's just absolutely horrible. Now, as you're probably all aware, in cases like this, the spouse is always the main suspect. It was no different here. Charles, he was their main suspect from the very beginning. They seemingly never looked anywhere else other than Charles McCrory, and they tried to do anything to put him there. Charles, he gave police open access to his apartment and to his Bronco and to his office at his job. I mean, he cooperated 100%, and the police never ever found anything. Once the coroner's report came back with those 2 marks on the back of her arm, they immediately scooped Charles up and took him to a dental office, and they had a dental impression made of his teeth. Well, back then, it took some time for those to come back. So they had that dental impression, and then they let him go. On June the 3rd of 1985, Julie was laid to rest right here in the cemetery, just a couple of blocks away from where they lived, where she was murdered. They had the service out here, and then immediately after the service was over, they could see like all the police cars and everything out, and the unmarked police cars sitting outside, but they didn't like come to the funeral services. They were just sitting out in the parking lot. And so the service ended and everybody's walking out there, and they stop Charles and they ask him to come in for another interview at the sheriff's office. And Charles agrees, and he gets in his truck and he drives there. And as soon as he got to the sheriff's office, they arrested him and charged him with the murder of Julie McCrory. What happened is they got the dental impression back, and when they set it up against a picture of those marks on the back of her arm, 2 of the teeth lined up with the 2 marks. And to them, they believed it was bite marks. So they immediately went to arrest him. Charles vigorously denied killing Julie. Charles was held right here in the now abandoned and haunted, they say, old Covington County Jail while he awaited his trial. The highly anticipated murder trial got underway on October the 21st of 1985, just 5 months after Julie's death. Now, Julie's family, they didn't believe that the state had enough evidence to put Charles away. So they hired private attorneys from the area, Frank and Harvey Tipler. Julie's family hired them to come in and prosecute Charles in this case, which is legal by Alabama state law. Now, the Tiplers, they had a reputation of getting the verdict that they wanted by any means necessary. And sometimes they were accused of being dirty and using underhanded tactics to get these verdicts. And as you'll see as we continue on, nothing would be different here. The prosecutors started off by calling Gloria Wiggins to the stand. Now, Gloria, she was that co-worker who Charles had an affair with. They tried to lead Gloria to say that Charles had killed his wife to be with her, and when she couldn't say that, she just kept saying how much he talked about his wife and he loved Julie and this kind of stuff. So when she didn't give them what they wanted, they completely embarrassed her on the stand. They chastised her for sleeping with a married man, and they made her look like a fool when she didn't give them what they wanted. So they got her off the stand, and next came the investigators. Because there was more evidence pointing towards Charles's innocence than his guilt, like that red bandana that didn't belong to him or the hair that didn't belong to him, they just glossed over all of that and they went right into the bite mark stuff. They had a forensic odontologist come in and say that these marks on the back of Julie's arm matched Charles McCrory's dental impression. After they got done with the bite marks, the prosecutors showed the jury pictures and a video that they recovered from the family home that Charles and Julie had made themselves consensually. It was of them having sex and using bondage, tying each other up and that kind of stuff. And then they tried to connect that to the pantyhose that was on Julie's arm to somehow say that they were connected. And then lastly, After that, they called up a neighbor to the stand who testified that they saw lights on in the McCrory's home at about 5:30 a.m., and they saw Charles's Bronco sitting outside in the driveway. Now, through cross-examination, that same witness admitted that his days from that time period all blurred together, and that he was not certain if he remembers seeing Charles there the morning that she died or a separate morning. He just couldn't remember. Well, after that, the defense, they start off by immediately calling up another neighbor who lives directly across the street. It was the person who they took the baby over to that morning, and that neighbor said that they woke up at 5 a.m. the morning of Julie's death, and at 5:30 they walked out to get the paper, and Charles's Bronco was 100% not there. The defense then moved on to another witness who worked for the excavating company that was directly behind the McCrory home. And this guy testified that he was at work between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. and he didn't see any lights on at the McCrory home, and he definitely did not see Charles's Bronco there. So after the defense rebutted the state's witness, they then went into the dental impressions, and they tried to explain that the marks on Julie's arms could easily have not been teeth impressions, but he really didn't offer up any other suggestions as to what those marks could have been. Although Charles's attorney tried his very best, let's face it, he was not an O.J. Simpson caliber attorney, and ultimately, despite no real evidence at all of Charles's guilt, a jury ultimately found Charles McCrory guilty based solely on that odontologist, like the dental bite mark testimony that he gave. Charles McCrory was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And now it should be noted too that some years later, after this trial happened, one of those prosecuting attorneys, Harvey Tipler, he was actually disbarred and arrested and convicted for the solicitation of murder. He tried to have a Florida state attorney killed, and then he was also convicted of racketeering for running a criminal enterprise. For 35 years, Charles McCrory sat in prison proclaiming his innocence, which obviously most inmates do. You can't go in any prison without them saying, "I'm innocent, I'm innocent." But Charles's story caught the attention of an Atlanta-based nonprofit group called the Innocence Project. They spoke to that odontologist who had spent the last 35 years discovering the inaccuracy of dental impressions. Now, in 1985, convictions based solely on dental impressions, it was a common thing. But nowadays, it's considered junk science, and they no longer accept that. It would be nearly impossible to convict someone solely on dental impressions in 2022. They're just not accurate. But back then, they believed they were. So the Innocence Project agrees to take over Charles's case, and they start reinvestigating, trying to get a retrial. They discovered that just 5 weeks after Julie's murder, a man named Alton Ainsworth was caught. He had kidnapped and raped another woman here in Andalusia, just 2 blocks away from the McCrory's home. Alton Ainsworth, he actually worked at that excavating company that was right behind the McCrory's home. You remember that footprint that was in the backyard that was like right there by the back fence going to that excavating company? And Ainsworth was also known to wear a red bandana on his head every day he went to work. Just like the red bandana they found under Julie's body, but then law enforcement lost it. Because they lost that bandana, and she had hair in her hand that didn't belong to her or Charles, and the police lost it, that means they were never able to test it against this Alton Ainsworth guy. And because of that, Alton Ainsworth has never been investigated for Julie's murder. In April of 2021, lawyers from the Innocence Project, they went here into the Covington County Courthouse, and they spoke with the judge, and they had a hearing, and they tried to get Charles's conviction overturned. They had the odontologist come in, and they had him tell the judge that he was wrong back in 1985, and he told the judge that he completely recanted his testimony that had gotten Charles convicted in the first place. By the end of it, the judge called for a recess, and they ultimately came back to Charles with a deal. They went to Charles and said that if he would change his plea to guilty after more than 3 decades later, if he would change his plea to guilty, then they would change his sentence to time served, and he could walk out of jail right then. Shockingly, Charles McCrory, he declined their offer, and he flat out told them he could not confess to killing Julie, even if it meant him having his freedom. He told him again he didn't do it. So Charles McCrory is still sitting in prison to this day here in the state of Alabama. The Innocence Project is still trying to get him a retrial, but as of February 14th, basically Andalusia and Covington County, they're basically saying no. I know that the Innocence Project lawyers have put in the paperwork to have it reconsidered and all that, so I don't know what steps come next. But what do you guys think? Is Charles McCrory innocent or guilty of killing his wife Julie? And what do you think about this Alton Ainsworth guy? Could he have been the actual killer of Julie, and he's just gotten away with it for all these years? I want to know what you guys think. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And I'm looking forward to reading your guys' thoughts on this, because I have my thoughts and I'm not really going to express them here, but I look forward to seeing what you guys think about it. That is going to do it for this video today here in Andalusia, Alabama, on the murder of Julie McCrory, and then her husband Charles McCrory, who has proclaimed his innocence and is still sitting in prison nearly 40 years later. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you're new here, go down, hit that subscribe button, then hit that notification bell so you get notified every time I upload a video. If you're wanting to help support the channel, you can check out the links down in the description box below. That's always much appreciated. But really, guys, I can't thank you all enough for watching my videos. It means a lot to me. Please, all of you, just stay safe, stay healthy, and much love to you all. And, you know, if Charles McCrory is innocent, hopefully the Innocence Project will get him out soon.